Hello and welcome to AP Psychology Unit 1 Review, the scientific foundations of psychology. Let's get right into it. So, first of all, for this, you'll need to know the different schools of thought in psychology. These are the different schools of thought. We'll go into them in more detail in the later slides. So, let's start about with structuralism. Basically, William Wundt made this thing called structuralism. It analyzes the structure of psychology. It's more like why does something work, or it kind of breaks it down in terms of if you have like a chemical equation, it breaks it down into elements, so it finds out why something works the way it does, and it doesn't really focus on the whole, it just focuses on one element. So for example, if I touch a pencil and I feel that it's sharp, then it focuses on that part, like understanding that sharpness is perceived in consciousness. That's one part. They don't really look at the whole human. Functionalism is by William James. He essentially made this school of thought that looked at why people behave the way they behave. So while structuralism is about how something works, it's functionalism is the behaviors. So it's like why. So say I like drink water. Why am I drinking water? Because I'm thirsty. That's what functionalism is trying to find. Gestalt psychology. Basically, Gestalt didn't like structuralism. He didn't like analyzing each part. He thought that humans are more than the sum of their parts. They're, whole. They have different things about themselves, and there is more than just a couple things together. And just functionalism and structuralism are not in use anymore. Neither is Gestalt psychology, but it's been combined into part of cognitive psychology, so it somewhat exists now. Um, so you can look at this picture right here. So most people would say there are four triangles, but the fourth triangle in the middle doesn't really exist. And that's what Gestalt is trying to get at. All these one, two, three, four, six components around this white triangle in the middle make it seem like there's a white triangle, even though that triangle doesn't exist. And that's what Gestalt psychology is getting at. Now, psychoanalysis. So Sigmund Freud is kind of the father of psychology in a way. He's the first person to actually like use psychology to help somebody. And Freud analyzed how the unconscious mind or dreams played a role in psychological mechanisms. So he would do this thing called psychoanalysis, where he would basically try to find out what's inside the unconscious mind of his patients. And then he thought that the unconscious was what dictated psychological disorders. So the unconscious is kind of like this part of your mind that you can't access, but it influences the way you think. And if Freud thought if we can change the unconscious, then we can change how we think. Freud is not anymore, like his techniques are not really used anymore, but that's basically what it is. Behaviorism is something that people use a lot, especially when you're conditioning, for example, like dolphins at the aquarium. You throw them some fish and they'll like do this trick, right? So basically that's operant conditioning. First we'll talk about like the different types of conditioning and how behaviorism works. So behaviorism is essentially like studying the behaviors of humans, why people behave. It's very similar to functionalism. Basically, Ivan Pavlov had this experiment where he kind of unintentionally discovered that dogs would start salivating whenever they heard this bell, because they knew that there would be a meal waiting for them, because they learned to associate the bell sound with food. So he realized that he could just sound the bell and they would start salivating because they thought that the food would be coming. So that's kind of what he found out. John Watson carried this to another level where he demonstrated that baby Albert, the little baby, would be afraid of like fluffy objects or like really non-scary objects by associating a loud sound with those fluffy objects. So for example, like a little bunny would come into the room, and Albert didn't really care about the bunny until a loud sound came, and every time that rabbit came in, a loud sound would be paired with that. And after that, baby Albert started associating the loud sound with the rabbit and decided, got scared every single time the rabbit would come in. B.F. Skinner made this thing called operant conditioning. There's different types of operant conditioning. You don't need to know that yet. That will be in the later units. But essentially, B.F. Skinner said that whenever you give someone a reward or if you give someone a consequence, they're gonna learn by that consequence. So, like for example, when you throw a fish to a dolphin at an aquarium and it performs a trick, you can give someone a reward to perform something for you. So, humanistic psychology, key people in this is Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. They essentially said that we have free will and individual choice. It's a very nice way of looking at psychology, and it's basically like, oh, people are like really, good people, and we need to think about our spiritual needs, our emotional, psychological needs. So this is kind of their pyramid, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He essentially says that your physical needs, your safety needs are really important, and then you move up the triangle as you try to become, more self-actualized, which is essentially, getting to your full potential. Cognitive psychologists examine behaviors and how we interpret, process, and remember information. John Piaget, I think he's French, so he has that weird name. John Piaget has this theory of cognitive development that focuses on how we think. So it's like basically throughout infanthood to adulthood, how do we change? And that's kind of what cognitive psychology is, like thinking about how the brain works in a way. Social cultural psychology, that's how people live. So it's like, how do cultures affect the way we interact? How do these different like social phenomenon, if I'm surrounded by like good friends, does that rub off on me and I become a better person? That's the type of thing that sociocultural psychologists look at. And biopsychosocial psychologists will look at biological, psychological, and social factors, and they'll analyze all of them to figure out a complete or whole picture about why people act like they are. So, for example, anorexia is given as the example here. But say like I have like a sleep disorder or something, then it might be biological. I might have there might be something in my head that's not doing really well, but it might be just psychological. Maybe I'm thinking like sleep disorder and I'm kind of like, it's happening, or maybe I have a lot of people in my friend group have like a sleeping disorder, so I'm thinking that I would also get a sleeping disorder and I have a sleeping disorder. So it combines all of those things and it puts it into one method. Now we need to talk about research studies. So we're going straight off the College Board CED, which is course and exam description. So first is the different types of psychology. Now is research studies. So this is the type of research studies. We're not going to go in depth to all of them because I think you guys probably know them. But experiments, essentially, you have a independent variable and a dependent variable. You manipulate the independent variable to get the dependent variable. Correlational studies, you look at two variables and how they're related, but you don't manipulate anything. So that's the big difference. Correlation is not causation because you're not manipulating anything. You're not proving that those two things are related. Survey research, essentially, you'll go out and you'll survey people. It's not the greatest way to research, and there's a lot of flaws. You need to know those, but I'm not going to go into depth. But basically, if you have a survey question, it can be interpreted in numerous different ways, so you have to be like kind of careful about how you word your questions. Naturalistic observation is essentially you observe things in the wild, not in the wild per se, but like essentially you don't manipulate anything and you just look at one thing and you make detailed jot down details. You don't the thing is you don't manipulate anything. Case studies, you do manipulate stuff. You look at one person or one thing throughout a long period of time. Longitudinal studies, you essentially look, it's the same thing except you look at a group of people over a really long period of time. And cross-sectional studies, you essentially study two groups of people on the same thing. So for example, it might be an experiment where you do one thing to fifth graders and you do the same thing to third graders and figure out if those two things, if fifth graders and third graders behave the same. Okay, experiments and correlation. So something really important is that random assignment is necessary in experiments. Basically, you have to sort people based on like randomness. So you have to randomly assign them so that the researchers don't know who is in what group, and then the researchers don't unintentionally create bias. The other thing is like the researchers shouldn't know who has a placebo and who doesn't. And then after the experiment, they can figure it out. And that way they don't have bias before they're like, oh, these guys have the placebo, so they're gonna act this way. These guys have the normal pill, so they're gonna act this way. That doesn't happen with random assignment because you randomly assign each person what if they get the placebo or not. The object of an experiment is to limit confounding variables. Essentially, we need to make sure that other variables don't influence how our dependent variable. So basically, say I have a gravity or something like I'm let's relate it to like a science lab, right? For example, what will happen like in chemistry, right? If you mix two elements together, there's always like air or water or something that like mixes with those elements, and you'll not usually get a perfect mass. So what you want to do is you want to limit that idea. So you want to make sure you have the least amount of air and least amount of water, and you want to replicate perfect lab conditions. Obviously, you can't do that every single time, but that's what we're trying to do in psychology. So, for example, we want to make sure that the people in the experiment have the least outside influence, and they also feel like they're comfortable in the environment, so they're not in a lab environment, so they act normally. Because sometimes in a lab, people act different than they actually do. And correlation does not mean causation. Very important. Unless you do an experiment, you can't figure out that something has causation. Correlation simply means that two things are related. You have to figure out that something caused something to say it caused. So you have to do an experiment. Measures of central tendency. So mean, median, mode, you probably have already heard in your math classes. Mean is essentially the average value. Median is the middle value, and mode is the most occurring value. Standard deviation is how close is everything to the mean. Range is the biggest value subtracted by the smallest value, and correlation coefficient is kind of important. It's essentially goes from -1 to 1. R is equal to -1 to 1, and basically whenever you have something that's close to 1 or close to -1, it's like a strong association. If it's in the middle, then it's like kind of weak, kind of strong. It's like middle, right? But basically, when you have a perfect R coefficient, it means everything lines up in a straight linear line. So we can say that it's perfectly correlated. If you have like a strong association, that's also pretty good. I think in psychology, you have to have a margin of error about like 5%. So, we want something like 95% correlated. The last thing we need to know is ethical guidelines. So we need to know that the ethical guidelines are made by the American Psychological Association. They essentially set rules on how, basically psychology experiments have to be ethical, because back in the day they weren't. Baby Albert was not ethical. Making a baby subject to those loud sounds was not ethical. That's not the worst that has happened in psychology. So there's obviously federal regulations now, and the IRB, it reviews every experiment that occurs. And the other thing you want to know is the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. That committee makes sure make sure that animals used in the studies cannot be put through too much harm, and the harm has to be within reasonable and within the scope of the study. So, as long as that review board makes sure that, or the committee makes sure that the animals used in the study are treated with minimal harm, and it's if the harm exists, then it's harm to an extent that it won't like hurt the animal too much. Hopefully, it's not perfect, but at least it's better than what we had before. There are a lot of terrible experiments in psychology that have happened. So that is it for today. That is all of what you need to know for AP Psychology Unit 1. I'd still highly go over your notes or something else, but that is all the stuff you need to know for Unit 1 of AP Psychology, Scientific Foundations of Psychology. When we do our Unit 2, it'll be on the biological basis of behavior. I hope you guys stick around for that one.